Good afternoon, and thank you for attending our session on Practical Theology and Digitality. Aline Knapp and I are very pleased to be here and would like to invite you to think with us about the relationship between practical theology and digitality. We want to present some findings of our chapter in the Handbook of Digital Theology, in which we explored how practical theology has engaged with digitality in recent years. At the same time, we would like to go beyond this original study and reflect on more recent developments in the field.
As you can see, we structured our presentation around three main parts. First, Sabrina is going to introduce our findings from our chapter at the Handbook. Here we analyzed 6 major journals of practical theology published between 2016 and 2022. But as you can already tell, 4 years have passed since then, which is why we want to, in the second part, want to take a look at the question, how does practical theology engage with digitality today? In the final part, we will ask what the development of recent years mean for the discipline today, and we will suggest 2 steps that we consider crucial for the future relationship between our discipline and digitality.
So let us begin with the findings we presented in our chapter for the Handbook of Digital Theology. For this study, we analyzed 6 major journals of practical theology: the IJPT, the CHET, Ecclesial Practices, HTS, Praktische Theologie, and Pastoral Theologie, and explored how they engage with digitality. The results reveal 2 distinct phases. Let me begin with the period before COVID. In the articles that we analyzed from 2016 onwards, digitality appears mostly as an emerging and still rather uncertain field. Practical theology was beginning to notice that digital media, mobile phones, online communication, and social media were becoming relevant for ecclesial and religious practices. However, research was still mainly exploratory. Digitality was often understood as new technology entering existing church practices. The questions were: what happens when smartphones are used in confirmation training? What happens when churches communicate online? What forms of participation become possible? And where do theological questions arise? So in this phase, digitality was often treated as something added to existing fields of practical theology, like religious education, church communication, pastoral care, homiletics, or liturgy. The quotation from Christian Albrecht captured this early moment very well. We translated it. Currently, it is still difficult to assess what advantages digital forms of communication will have for all those involved. The degree of acceptance of increasingly digitalized communication is hardly predictable. I think, was it 2017?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. This sentence reflects a field marked by openness, but also by uncertainty. Digitality was not yet interpreted as a broader cultural condition. It was mostly discussed as development whose practical consequences still had to be tested. In other words, practical theology was asking whether these new forms would be accepted, whether they would support ecclesial communication, and whether they would open up new forms of participation. But the deeper questions of digitality reshaping religious practices itself was not yet fully in view. COVID changed this situation dramatically. So we are here now in the COVID phase. During the pandemic, digital religious practices became unavoidable. Churches, communities, ministers, educators, pastoral workers rapidly moved into digital formats like online worship, Zoom meeting, digital spiritual care, online religious education, streaming, social media, and so on and so on and so on. In our analysis, COVID therefore functions as a catalyst. It did not create digital religion, but it accelerated its visibility, urgency, and everyday relevance. What is striking is that ecclesial practices often preceded theological theory. Churches had to act while practical theology was a little bit behind and had not yet fully developed the conceptual and methodological tools to analyze what was happening. Many studies during this period therefore tried to observe, describe, and interpret practices that were already taking place. At the same time, digital space was often still imagined as relatively separate from the real analogous life. Digital worship, online church, or digital communication were frequently analyzed as distinct spaces or formats. Methodologically, many articles rely on established empirical methods like interviews, participatory observation, case study surveys, or digital ethnography. These methods were valuable, but they did not yet fully ask whether digitality also requires methodological innovation.
As you've already heard, the analysis Sabrina was just presenting ended in 2022, which is why we want to take a quick look into what happens in the field since then. So in preparation for our talk today, we again analyzed the same journals and looked at their engagement with digitality. One observation stood out to us, which can be described as a certain tension. On the one hand, we noticed that the theoretical discussion has broadened considerably. So more and more authors are do not longer understand digitality simply as a technological change or in the perspective of the use of digital media. Instead, digitality is increasingly described as a cultural condition that shapes contemporary life as a whole. And we do have a quotation again, which we translated. It's by Antonia Lübke and Uta Catalon, and that demonstrates this theoretical view quite well. The digital expansion of our world is no longer merely an addition to everyday life. It has become an integral part of it. Today, our lives unfold at the intersection of online and offline realities. In many different forms and nuances, we navigate the world in what Luciano Floridi has called an on-life condition. On the other hand, though, we noticed that empirical research remains focused on rather institutionalized topics or ecclesial practices. So many recent studies continue to investigate online worship, hybrid liturgy, or post-pandemic church life, and therefore church practice. And while these obviously are important topics, they mainly ask how churches use digital technologies rather than how digitality shapes contemporary religious life more broadly. For us, this observation points to an interesting challenge and raises the question of how the discipline might further develop its perspectives and methods in order to engage with post-digital realities of religious life. And this leads us to the third part of our presentation. The tensions I've just described demonstrate that empirical practical theology still needs to find adequate ways of engaging with the complexity of post-digital phenomena, which is why we want to suggest two steps that could further strengthen empirical research. Our first argument is that the theoretical insights on digitality need to be translated more consistently into empirical research designs. We would therefore suggest two shifts. First, we propose a shift in or regarding the object of studies. So rather than focusing primarily on institutional processes of digitalization, as I've just described, practical theology should pay greater attention to post-digital life worlds. So starting from everyday human experience will make it possible to study the entanglement of digital and analog practices more thoroughly or more closely. This means that practical theology should continue to pay greater attention to phenomena that often remain outside institutional perspectives, such as the entanglement between everyday spirituality and the smartphone use, as Mike does, for example.
The second shift we suggest affects the research questions. We should not only ask what digitality changes or formulate explicitly digital research question. Instead, we should ask about human experiences as they are post-digital by nature. A recent example that received considerable public attention in German-speaking contexts illustrates this point. The actress and TV presenter Colleen Fernandez made public that for years, fake online profiles and AI-generated pornographic deepfake depicting her had been circulated on the internet. She describes these experiences as a form of rape because although the violence took place through digital media, its consequences were experienced physically and emotionally in everyday life. The public debate itself highlights an important theoretical point here. If we separate digital and analog contexts too strictly, we risk overlooking precisely these dynamics. The question is therefore not simply how digitality changes human life, but how human experiences are constituted with post-digital realities in which digital and analog dimensions are already deeply intertwined. From this perspective, practical theology should ask about human experiences and therefore automatically think post-digital. Rather than asking only what happens online or offline, it then asks how people experience embodiment, vulnerability, care, or community under post-digital conditions.
Our second suggestion, cliffhanger, here, is that empirical theology or empirical practical theology on digitality can benefit from a stronger engagement with critical theory. And by this, and I think that's important, we do not mean that practical theology lacks critical perspectives on digitality. It's like, on the contrary, existing research already identifies both central pathologies and central potentials of digital religious practices. So it's not critical thinking itself that's missing, but a more comprehensive synthesis of these different critical perspectives. So what we observe is that individual studies or single studies on digitality are often not brought into dialogue with one another. And this is where the lens of critical theory can become relevant. Let's go back all the year to 1985, when Nancy Fraser famously criticized Jürgen Habermas by asking whether his theory can really be called critical if it ignores the marginalization of women. Her point is that critical theory should not focus on only one form of domination while ignoring others. Instead, it should contribute more comprehensively to what she calls, quote, the self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age. And we want to argue that this insight is equally relevant for practical theology. So we don't fully understand digitality if we only look at its capitalist structures, but also if we focus exclusively on empowerment or individual use, we risk neglecting the platform's logics and the economic structures that obviously shape them. So that means a genuinely critical practical theology therefore needs to relate these different perspectives to one another. And while this sounds quite nice, I don't think that this is an easy task for practical theology, as this has to be balanced with one of probably the greatest achievements of the discipline in the recent years, namely its commitment to contextuality through careful empirical attention to specific communities and specific practices. That means practical theology has to find concepts and ways to relate its commitment to contextuality to a more comprehensive synthesis of different perspectives. One promising starting point, I'm sure there are many, but one that's promising in our view is the sociological concept of gradualized agency, which was developed by Werner Rammert and Ingo Schulz-Schäfer. The concept is based on two central ideas. At first, agency exists in different degrees and can therefore include both human and technological artifacts. And second, the concept does not determine in advance who or what can act and to what extent, but it says that the distribution of agency between humans and technologies should become an empirical question. And this has two advantages for practical theology. It preserves the discipline's commitment to contextuality as it is an empirical form of studying practices. And at the same time, it opens the analysis to a plurality of perspectives. So not only users, but also digital artifacts, the logics embedded within them, and even the people who design these technologies can become part of the same analysis.
Let us briefly summarize our argument. Over the last decade, practical theology has developed a much broader understanding of digitality. Rather than viewing it merely as a technological phenomenon, digitality is increasingly understood as a cultural condition that shapes contemporary religious life. At the same time, our analysis suggests that empirical research has not yet fully translated this theoretical insight into its research designs. We therefore argue for a stronger focus on post-digital life worlds and human experiences, as well as for a more comprehensive dialogue between different critical perspectives. In this sense, we argue that the task for practical theology today is not to develop a separate theology of digitality, but to integrate digitality as a natural and critical dimension of practical theological research as such. Thank you very much for your attention in this late afternoon, early morning, or even in the middle of the night.